Due to some constraints on time with the commission, I want to make sure that all commissioners are here for deliberation. I'm limiting 5 more minutes for either of you. So please proceed.
For me?
Yes, for you too. Sorry.
I just started. Okay. All right. Mr. O'Boyle's primary point in regard to that is that paragraph 5 allows him to do anything on the property as he describes the property as he wishes to. But he takes that paragraph in isolation without giving consideration to the other paragraphs. Paragraph 35 is probably the most telling argument, and it talks about, and that's on page 15, it talks about the development agreement which each party anticipated entering into as a part of the settlement agreement will include a building envelope for the property, as designated by O'Boyle pursuant to the preceding paragraph. So it's referencing the preceding paragraph defining what he can do on the property, but it's describing that it shall be within the building envelope for the property as designated by O'Boyle. I would also call your attention to the fact that the agreement defines the building envelope for the property as designated by O'Boyle pursuant to paragraph 35. So again, O'Boyle was agreeing to the description of the property as described in paragraph 36, which talks about the area between the intracoastal waterway, the private roads, and the common property line to the west. So that's the property that we're talking about. That's the property that was identified in in Exhibit C to the agreement. Let's look further at the agreement on page 3. Page 3 of the agreement contemplates, it's hard to do this in 5 minutes, but at any rate, it contemplates that the development agreement, and this is under number 3 on page 3, the development agreement shall contain terms consistent with the terms set forth herein. Mr. O'Boyle is arguing that the terms of the development agreement are inconsistent with the settlement agreement, yet they entered into this agreement stating that the development agreement shall be consistent with the terms set forth herein, and Mr. O'Boyle signed the development agreement, thereby agreeing to this applying to the property that's described in Exhibit and crosshatched in Exhibit C. I think it's also important that we look at paragraph 19 of the development agreement itself. If you allow me a minute to turn to that. Paragraph 19 says building envelope. Attached hereto and incorporated herein as Exhibit C is a copy of a survey, which survey provides a building envelope of the property as defined in the settlement agreement. So here again, he is talking about the property as defined in the settlement agreement. So there's nothing inconsistent between paragraph 35 and the development agreement and what's called for in paragraph 36, that nothing shall be built other than in the crosshatched area between the intercoastal waterway, the roadway, and the side yards. So finally, he also looks at paragraph 18 as conflicts. He says there are conflicts, but as I demonstrated through my argument, there are no conflicts between the development agreement and the settlement agreement. They are consistent. Now look at Exhibit C, the diagram, which is consistent with paragraph 3B of the settlement agreement, which defines the property. And again, they're making it look like that Exhibit C means that anything can be built over the water. That's not what it says. It carves out the provision which talks about our allowing anything to be built in the crosshatched area which wasn't regulated by the 1981 agreement from that, because it says that anything that's built over the water is going to have to be in compliance, approved by the town, i.e., as Rita Taylor has stated, in compliance with town code. So that's why you're here today, to determine whether or not this is in compliance with the town code. And I suggest to you that it is not. And I think all you have to do is to compare the settlement agreement to the development agreement, realize that the two are tied together, there was nothing in conflict with it. If there was anything in conflict in the development agreement, why would Mr. O'Boyle have signed it? The settlement agreement was at the end of July, and we were looking at early September for the development agreement. So we moved from the settlement agreement into the development agreement, and everything that was done in the development agreement was consistent with the settlement agreement. Based upon my time, I'm not sure I have anything else to say other than to look at the two agreements, and I think you will note that they go hand in hand. They are not differentiated. Paragraph 35 is not differentiated from the remaining intent of the parties, or in fact, the wording of the parties. 36 describes the property and what may be built on the property. And that property is between the intercoastal and the roadway. And then anything that happens later has to be, over the water, has to be in accordance with code. I think that's all I have in my over
That was
5
pretty
minutes.
good. That was good. That was good.
All right, I will definitely be less than the 7 minutes. But,
You're not getting so.
I'm not getting 7, get 5, so I'll
Yeah,
get
5.
to 52.
And even that was being threatened.
Okay, so
Just joking.
first of all, I think as the board is aware, it seems that there's a position being taken that the provisions in the code are permissive as opposed to mandatory. In other words, if the code does not say that we can build it, then we cannot build it. I would respectfully suggest that that is not the way that zoning laws are interpreted. We all start with the default notion that we can build out our properties any way that we see fit. We have constitutional protections to do what we want with our property, subject to reasonable zoning regulations that further the health, safety, and welfare of the community. So I can build it unless you specifically tell me that what I want to build is caught within a definition that prohibits what it is that I want to build. So that's my first point. It's not permissive. If your code does not say we cannot build it, we should be able to build it. You can amend your code in any way that you see fit, but that has not been done. As far as, we're not taking the position that anything can be built in the water. We are only taking the position that Exhibit C says that water structures may be built in the water, and it specifically says that decks may be built in the water. There is conflict, not necessarily with the entire agreement. We're not saying that the whole development agreement is in conflict with the whole settlement agreement, but the development agreement says that any terms or provisions that are in conflict, the settlement agreement controls. The development agreement, we've heard everybody say, and I believe the testimony has been clear, that the town's position is that the development agreement, and that Exhibit C, says that water structures may be built, if approvable, by the town under the current code. That's the conflict, because the settlement agreement has a paragraph that says everything is under the 1981 code. So where there is a conflict, settlement agreement controls. There is a conflict as relating to that interpretation of Exhibit C of the development agreement. There is, not all the terms are inconsistent, I just talked about that. The other point is, it says that we can build between the Intracoastal Waterway and the roads. Well, the Intracoastal Waterway is down the canal. This is a private canal. Intracoastal Waterway is not there. There's no Intracoastal Waterway Authority that says you can't build in the water. So technically speaking, his envelope is his property line. I know that I've got 3 more minutes. I know he wants to say a couple closing words. If I may just have him close for me, that's what I prefer to do. It's my time, I'd imagine, so I'd like to waive it to my client.
All right, Mr. O'Boyle, you want to speak for a couple minutes?
Yes, the only thing I would like to say is this, we can call a promenade, a deck, or a boardwalk. On my plan, we currently show piling. If the town wants, we can eliminate the piling and do a cantilever, as is already done in Hidden Harbor. I don't think anyone sitting there could, without straining credulity there, could say that this is a dock. So I'd be willing, as a condition, to put a fence up just like this. As far as the smaller portion, the dock, which is at the east end of the home, our belief is that in 1981, there was no setback and there was no requirement for a dock to be 5 foot, 8 foot, or 4 foot. Nonetheless, 5 foot, I think, is applicable. The heights between the seawall and a 5.5 foot height, I think, is appropriate for a dock. Although I don't think I have to comply with a setback, if the town is concerned, we can remove the dock portion of the plan and just stick with the promenade. I think the dock is appropriate, but we can remove that portion if that is your concern about us encroaching on the setback. And once again, the subject only to 1981. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, that concludes the evidence being presented to the board. We will now proceed to deliberate. This deliberation is a public hearing, so it is conducted here in the public. So who would like to begin discussing all of the evidence here today?
Let me just add that what a statement I made earlier in relation to Mr. O'Boyle's last statement, and that is, this is not the time or place for you to be attempting to mitigate or look at a different plan. I think Mr. O'Boyle can come to the staff, depending upon what happens today, and suggest something different, such as he has talked about. If you're here only to make a determination as to whether or not the appeal, as stated, should be sustained or overruled.
Yes, understood. Joan, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are the developer's agreement, under my past experience, was for the property itself, nothing to do with the water. That's what I recollect. What the evidence presented, I think it's a difficult situation. But I stand behind the staff.
Well, it seems to me that you've got to, that there are a number of arguments, and I really commend both counsel for doing a very good job of putting forward legal and factual arguments to support their cases. You know, the primary issue is, does the settlement agreement limit the town to a previous code interpretation? And secondarily, does the promenade or deck violate any sort of code requirement in 81 or alternatively in after 91? And taking into account, anyways, the way I see it is that it focuses first of all on Exhibit C, and that is, I think as Mr. Randolph explained, the building envelope, and there's quite a bit of discussion about the building envelope, but the development agreement, which spelled out this, you know, the cross-hatching in Exhibit C, signed by Mr. O'Boyle subsequent to the settlement agreement, makes it pretty clear that it supports what Joan recalls as to what went on during that period of time, and that is water was totally separate from the property, the building envelope as described. So I'm not at all convinced that anything but the current code would apply to this application. Agreements, disagreements?
Well, I mean, most of us were all in the deliberations, not all for the agreements, but, you know, looking at the agreement on its face, I mean, clearly we've spent a lot of time, both councils, with the exhibits, especially Exhibit C, referencing back and forth to the paragraphs, and it's, you know, I'm still looking at it, and we spent a lot of time on the paragraph, which has been on Exhibit C, which has been read into the record numerous times. You know, you're looking at the crosshatched area, and then to further define that, you know, as part of the agreement, Mr. O'Boyle is not precluded from building a structure, which is why it's there. However, it's gotta be in accordance with the codes. It's gotta be approved by the town of Gulfstream. You know, again, it's been read into the record, I need to, you know, parse my words here. You know, indicating that it's gotta be approved by the code. So, you know, if there's a consensus among the board, we haven't heard from everybody. You know, the building envelope is crosshatched area, it stops at the water. You know, that's subject to the contents of the agreement, the 1981 code, and then, you know, well, yes, you can build any of the elements that are defined in the paragraph in Exhibit C. You know, it's subject to the current code. You know, if there's a consensus that we move past that argument, and that's what the consensus is here, then we're into argument number 2 is, okay, we've spent the applicant's counsel who did a very nice job. We were talking into, well, is a deck defined or not? What is it? Is it a dock? You know, and of course, we currently have all the opinions of staff that are in writing that are entered into the record. So, I mean, I think that's probably the,
Does anyone
Yeah.
believe that the current code does not apply? The previous code, as argued by the applicant, applies? Does anybody believe that?
From Exhibit C, you know, that talks about the water structures and it references decks, pilings, and codes, but it provides that such water structures were approved by the town of Gulfstream. So I think that's a defining.
Yeah, that was a point
statement.
made by the witnesses and in these documents, that, regardless,
So
it has to be approved by the town.
regardless of whatever, it has to be approved by the town.
And I must say that was going through my mind the whole time is that, you know, deck, dock, promenade. This is a 12-foot structure, almost twice the height of what, according to what the witness said, 4 feet to 7.5 feet above water line, branching out that width. And I'm just thinking, under any interpretation of any code, we have always looked at the impact on the neighbors in terms of the town granting approval to an application. And I'm looking at this, if that were being viewed by the other residents in that small little code, I just think it would be very offensive. But that's an aside. I think Tom is correct. Unless someone believes that the earlier code applies, we move on to the second argument, which is the deck, promenade, dock definitions, and the setbacks.
I fully understand the issues. I heard clearly your interpretation, I heard clearly your interpretation, and I don't have any questions, and I'm processing, and when asked, I'll vote.
Well, there is an argument made that this is not to be interpreted as a dock. It should be interpreted as something else. That definition seemed to be fluid, but it can't be used as a dock. It's not supposed to be used as a dock. But I think as Mr. Randolph said, you know, whether they intend to use it as a dock or whether it actually looks, acts, sounds, and appears like a dock, for the duck analogy, sure seems like it would fall under that section of the code. And the size of it, under our current code, would be offensive just by its nature in terms of the effect on the neighborhood and the neighborhood district in which it lies. Thoughts?
Just the fact that the code, I mean, you can't speak to every word in the language that someone might come up to, so the words that they give, decks, pilings, docks, you know, that it's the idea that it's the idea that you have in mind. I mean, you could get a thesaurus and look up and find 20 other words that would be dock or deck, and because the code doesn't say them specifically, it could negate the code entirely.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It's almost a way of shoehorning in something by a negative. Saying, oh, because you haven't spelled out exactly what we're describing, therefore we're allowed to do it. We can do whatever we want. And I found that argument very unpersuasive.
I mean, I think you get the idea of what's going on, and you have to somewhat look into the spirit of what's good. And I agree totally when I was looking at the footprint of the water in the code, how it would infringe on neighbors. I mean, even getting boats in and out of there, if the structure is 15 feet, you know, it would be right about where the opening is coming in. It would really inconvenience anything around it. Now, whether those issues are part of this discussion, legally, I don't know, but they would be considerations that the town.
Do we have this, hold that, but do we have this drawing blown up? As, you know, we're reviewing the application, drawing the plan. The applicant have it?
We're headed on the PowerPoint.
We're kind of discussing, I think, phase 2 here. Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Is a smaller version of that already in evidence? Excuse me.
Yes.
Okay, all right.
We could put it on PowerPoint.
Yeah.
That's
Let's
not
see how wide it is. I mean, the point of, you know, it's obviously been entered into evidence. The point of looking at this again is that you're, you know, assessing it under the current code. And you're looking at the overall width, location, and as the mayor said, you know, the effect of approving a structure on the neighbors and whatnot. And, you know, solely relying, because it doesn't say anything in the code, that means we can do it. Again, both of you just touched on that. It's obviously an opportunity to relook again. I mean, we've looked at it all morning. It's exactly what is being proposed, you know, visually and on the plan, as opposed to our arguments that are evolving back and forth.
Well, what's being proposed is more than twice the
It's
width
12.
of the deck. That's being
12 and
adopted.
5, right,
Right?
all the way to the end of the property line.
And essentially without setback adjustments.
Thank you. Anyway, John, I didn't mean to cut off your comment about the code and what's in it and what's not.
Yeah, there's some variation. There was a 5-foot section there at one end, but the vast majority of the structure looks like it's 4 feet or so, according to the testimony. And also very high. And it invades both setbacks. So, you know, frankly, I can't see that town staff would have acted in any way other than what manner they did in rejecting this.
My other comment, I think we have the code section. Do we have, I don't know if Trey or the town manager, do we have the deck and pool narrative or descriptions? Do we have the pool section somewhere?
Of the
I'm
code?
trying to speed this, I'm trying to hurry this along, Commissioner.
Yeah, he's looking it up right now.
He's got it.
Trey.
Oh, there's one going on, Unicode? Okay.
May I just point something out that I think maybe,
No, we're in deliberations, Mr. O'Poole.
okay,
This exercise is just involved as to staff opinion and also relating to, Ms. Taylor's testimony in cross.
Consistent with what Ms. Taylor testified to, Dex, on that piece of
Yes.
the code.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
Yeah, you need to speak up. This is in response to a question, this isn't testimony presented by either side, but you've asked a question.
No, this is in response to this is a deliberation or a question, just looking, highlighting a section of the code that was discussed in prior testimony in today's proceeding as part of our deliberation. Well, just trying to see if we have those. Just trying to see if there was a concise discussion, and we'll move quickly off of this. Swimming pools, and then ironically, docks are right after the code. Let's see. Oops. Anyway, I've seen what I've seen. I'm just looking at section 66-367. We can move on to this.
Well, is there anyone who believes that the promenade as applied for does not fall under the 66-1 section regarding docks and their limitations? Is that a yes or no?
No.
That is, in terms of the staff analyzing this application, would that not be where they would go? Would that not be what they would look at? Would the duck that walks and quacks and whatever, wouldn't that suggest you go to that section? This is a structure built on, as I said, applied for, on pilings across water that is twice the width, higher, and encroaching on setbacks of any other dock in the town.
I'm sure the application as presented had pilings on the outside, into the 12-foot section, as I recall from the testimony and evidence presented. And for applying it to the current code, which is in existence now, in the code section that's reviewable is the dock section. That section of the town code referencing dock 66-1.
And when I reviewed it, I went to the dock section, that was the way that would guide me to interpret the application. So dock section, yes, I mean, it applies to this application. I would have no other reason to think otherwise, to be honest. I mean, that's how I approached it. I could be wrong, but that's how I approached it. And I think the average person would approach it the same way. We had anybody else propose promenades? Has been any other confusion about the interpretation?
No. None.
I mean, the fact that the applicant says, no, it's not a dock, I'm not gonna use it as a dock, I don't find particularly persuasive. Whether they would or they wouldn't, that's not really the issue. It's what is applied for and how it should be interpreted under the code. And I think we all would have looked at it the way staff did. And on its nature, it seems to be a way of trying to shoehorn something that would not be permitted in the town of Gulfstream and under our code and our understanding of our neighborhoods and our districts and water structures. It's trying to shoehorn something in based on the negative, but we don't talk about prominence. Anybody have anything else they want to add?
I mean, I just want to highlight the point, just for the parties involved. I have pages and pages of notes, but I think the arguments made by both sides were pretty clear. I mean, you know, if we, obviously, we already addressed building envelope and, which of the applicable codes could apply. You know, and then we kind of went into, deck versus deck promenade, which is synonymous, which is what the applicant presented. One part of it being a dock that's 5 foot wide. And then, you know, we kind of moved into, again, under the current code, is this, just because you don't necessarily have a deck in the context of this application defined in the code, that means an applicant, whoever they may be, can do it. I mean, I think, you know, there's, you know, obviously there's, when you receive an application, and we've been through this numerous times, again, this is in regard to a building permit, but, you know, some of the same standards and what a board has to do apply. You're looking at the code, you're looking at the applicability, and you're also looking at, you know, other factors. You know, if it's, something's not specifically defined, I mean, would it normally be approved? You know, taking into account the neighborhood, you know, what's going on in the water, and again, the applicant, you know, for what it's worth, did try to demonstrate, which may not be relevant to the application, the surrounding area. You know, if it was up on the screen, again, I'm not really using that in my analysis, but there wasn't anything of that size, although the applicant did point out some other structure. But, you know, there's a little bit more that goes into it than, again, just because it's not clearly defined in the code as something you can or can't do, that you can do it. I mean, there's a little bit of discretion, not much, but, I mean, so.
That sounds like a pretty good summary tonight. Any other points or comments? Well, we've been asked to either grant or to deny the applicant's appeal. And so we're looking for, if there's no further discussion, sounds to me like we're all in agreement that the appeal should be denied and the actions of the planning and building administrator to be affirmed. Is there a motion to that effect?
So typically we make motions in the affirmative. Is that correct?
Well, here, the matter before you is to whether to grant or deny the appeal, so that would be your motion, and it would be based upon the competent substantial evidence that you heard here today. And I think in your deliberations, you have sort of made findings, and there's no requirement that you make findings, but if you'd like to, in your motion, indicate your findings. Remember, there were 2 points. One, does the current code preclude the dock? And in regard to the settlement agreement, Mr. O'Neill's point was that the settlement agreement provides that the, I'm mixing you up now, but it talks about the 1981 agreement.
Yeah.
If you know what I'm going.
So I'll put a motion on the floor. It's a motion to deny the application by the applicant for the building application as proposed, based on the findings of fact that, one, in regard to the application brought before the town, that the current town code applies, specifically section, got a lot of docs, 66.1 and 66-369 regarding docks. And 2, that based on the opinion and decision of the town staff, that the application as presented by the applicant does not meet the town code with regard to docks.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Ms. Taylor?
Commissioner Lyons,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Stanley,
Yes.
Commissioner White,
Yes.
Commissioner Orthwyne,
Yes.
Mayor Morgan.
Yes. Thank you very much, gentlemen. Good presentation. Good interesting discussion. We're concluding the Board of Adjustment hearing. You need to leave.
Guess what I have?
Nikki's offered to trade.
Sorry, I mean, at this point. Yeah, why don't you take this?
Yeah, and that means.
Scott, if you want one, I'll just send you something else.
Yeah.
PowerPoint, there's 2 pages that you have.
Okay.
I guess you'll pull next week.
Yeah, so it's pretty quickly.
Was he here, right, sir?
Does he need to use
Tell him to have a change, he wants to know.
Well, they want to trade that for all the rest of the money. Greg's checking to see if there's some.
Miami every Friday. You know, try to call him at,
I guess I could.
2 o'clock. I'm sorry, Mr. Brazen.
I guess Fred's
Well, I mean, I can say.
Apparently, I can get Rebecca. Rebecca,
You know what?
can you take this?
Well,
I can.
Can I take Mr. Lyons to the airport?
If Trey comes in here and sits, then you can take it.
Can I take Mr. Lyons to the airport?
Trey's, yeah, Trey may be commenting on some of the
Yeah, I
things
think
we're
Trey
doing.
may
so-
have.
So I'm gonna, you don't need me.
You offer to.
I'm gonna leave,
Thank you,
and I can take him back.
Hey Greg, I can take Mr. Lyons to the airport, there's not a problem, Renee can operate this thing.
Okay, well, one of you take him.
We'll fight you over it.
Because he needs to go.
Tell Trey that he's.
Now, we're in recess for 2 minutes.